The pen felt heavier than it should have. Nesta stared at the line where her signature was supposed to go, her hand trembling above the paper like it belonged to someone else. Outside the tall windows of the Moretti Syndicate's boardroom, Palermo's evening lights blinked on, one by one, indifferent to the fact that a girl's entire future was about to be decided in this cold, marble-floored room. "You don't have to shake like that," said the man across the table, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "It's just a signature." Just a signature. Nesta almost laughed. This wasn't just a signature. This was the price of her brothers' lives. 3 months ago, Bram and Kian, her twin brothers, only 22 and reckless in the way boys who've never known real fear are reckless, had borrowed money from the wrong people to keep their shipping business afloat. What started as a small loan from a syndicate-linked lender spiraled into something monstrous. Interest stacked on interest. Threats turned into visits. Visits turned into men standing outside their apartment door at midnight, saying nothing, just watching. Nesta had been the one to answer the door the night they came to collect. She still remembered the way her voice had cracked when she begged them for time. And she remembered, even more clearly, the way the man in the dark coat had smiled and said there was another way to settle the debt entirely. A marriage. Not to erase the debt with money, to erase it with her. She'd said yes before she even let herself think about what it meant. Her brothers were her whole world, the only family she had left since their parents passed. She would have signed anything. So here she was, in a boardroom that smelled like leather and old money, about to marry a man she had never met. "Sign it, Nesta," her brother's lawyer murmured beside her, his voice gentle but urgent. "It's the only way." She dipped the pen and signed her name. Nesta Calder. The letters looked shaky and small against the thick cream paper, swallowed up by the seal of the Moretti family stamped beside it. The moment the pen lifted from the page, the doors at the far end of the room opened, and he walked in. Nesta's breath caught somewhere in her throat. He was tall, taller than any man she'd ever stood near, with shoulders that filled out his dark suit like it had been built around him rather than the other way around. His jaw was carved sharp, his eyes a shade of grey so cold they looked like they belonged to a winter she'd never survive. He didn't look at her so much as through her, the way you'd glance at a piece of furniture that had just been delivered. "Don Malachor," the lawyer whispered beside her, as if the name itself required reverence. Nesta had heard whispers of that name before, in hushed conversations at cafes, in newspaper headlines that never printed his face, in the fearful way people lowered their voices when they mentioned the Moretti Syndicate's most dangerous ally. She'd imagined him as a shadow, a rumor. She hadn't imagined he'd be real, standing 10 feet away from her, radiating a kind of quiet menace that made the hair on her arms rise. He didn't say a word to her, not one. He simply gave a single, curt nod to the men flanking him, turned, and walked back out the way he came. That was it. That was her introduction to her husband. Nesta stood frozen, staring at the space where he'd been, her heart hammering so loud she was sure the whole room could hear it. That's the man I just married my life to. A stranger who couldn't even spare her a full glance. "Miss Calder?" The voice that pulled her back was nothing like his. It was soft, warm even, in a room that had felt like ice a second ago. She turned to find a man stepping toward her, younger looking, maybe early 30s, dressed in a simple grey suit that made no attempt to intimidate anyone. He had kind hazel eyes and a gentle, almost apologetic smile, a leather folder tucked under one arm, like he'd just stepped out of an ordinary office job rather than a criminal empire's headquarters. "I'm Kalen," he said, extending a hand. "I handle the administrative side of things here. Contracts, logistics, paperwork, the parts nobody wants to deal with." His smile widened slightly, self-deprecating. "I promise I'm far less frightening than the Don." Despite everything, despite the tears she'd been fighting back all evening, Nesta felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. It was the first thing that had felt human to her all night. "I just need you to look over a few final details," Kalen continued, guiding her gently toward a smaller side table, away from the intimidating length of the boardroom. And then I can tell you something that might make tonight a little easier. What's that? Nesta asked, her voice still unsteady. Kaylin looked at her with something that resembled genuine warmth, an emotion she hadn't expected to find anywhere in this building. Your brother's debt, he said. It's cleared, fully. As of the moment you signed that contract, Bram and Kian owe this family nothing. Nesta's eyes stung immediately, relief crashing into her so hard she had to grip the edge of the table. It's really over. They're safe. They're safe, Kaylin confirmed. You did that. Not the man who just walked out of here. You. For the first time since she'd stepped into that cold Palermo boardroom, Nesta let herself breathe. She didn't know, not yet, that the real terms of her marriage, the real man behind the name signed at the bottom of that contract, were nothing close to what she imagined. She didn't know that the towering stranger with the winter-grey eyes was, in many ways, the least dangerous man in that room. She only knew that a soft-spoken administrator with kind eyes had just handed her the first piece of hope she'd felt in months. It would not be the last time Kaylin made her feel safe, and it would not be the last time that safety came with a secret folded quietly beneath it. The car wound along a cliffside road for nearly an hour before Nesta caught her first glimpse of Villa Bellator, and when she did, she pressed her palm flat against the window. The estate rose out of the Sicilian coastline like something carved by the sea itself. Pale stone walls, arched windows catching the afternoon sun, terraces dripping with bougainvillea in shades of violent pink. Below the cliffs, the Mediterranean stretched out in an endless sheet of blue, so bright it almost hurt to look at. It was beautiful. It was also, she reminded herself, a cage. Just a very expensive one. She had spent the entire drive from Palermo bracing herself. She imagined guards at every door, locked wings, a husband who would treat her like property to be inventoried and stored. She imagined isolation, cold rooms, and rules she wouldn't be told until she'd already broken them. What she got, instead, was Kaylin. He was waiting at the gates when the car rolled to a stop, hands in his pockets, that same gentle, unhurried smile on his face from the boardroom 3 nights ago. He opened her door himself before any of the staff could reach it. "You made good time," he said, as if she'd arrived for a pleasant visit rather than the start of a life sentence. "How was the drive?" "Long," Nesta admitted, stepping out onto the gravel, her legs stiff. "Quiet." "The Don travels separately," Kaylin said, catching the question she hadn't asked yet. "He keeps to the East Wing, mostly. You likely won't cross paths often." He said it plainly, without judgment, as though he understood exactly what kind of relief that information would bring her. "I thought, instead, I'd show you around myself, if that's all right." It was more than all right. It was the first choice anyone had offered her in days. They walked the grounds slowly, Kaylin pointing out details with the kind of quiet pride of someone who genuinely loved the place. The old stone well near the orange grove, the chapel with its faded frescoes, the little cove accessible by a stairway cut into the cliff face. He didn't rush her. He didn't treat her like a delivery being logged into inventory the way she'd feared. He treated her like a guest. "This is yours," he said finally, pushing open a set of double doors on the villa's western side. Nesta stepped into a bright, airy wing filled with soft linen curtains, a canopy bed dressed in pale blue, and floor-to-ceiling windows that opened onto a private balcony overlooking the sea. It was nothing like the sparse, functional room she'd braced herself for. It looked like somewhere a person could actually breathe. "I don't understand," she said quietly, running her fingers along the windowsill. "I thought..." She stopped herself, unsure how to say, "I thought I'd be a prisoner here," out loud. "You thought you'd be locked away," Kaylin finished for her, without a trace of mockery. "I understand why. Most arrangements like this one aren't kind. But you're not a prisoner here, Nesta. You're his wife. That comes with certain freedoms, whether he chooses to exercise them with you personally or not." There was something in the way he said, "whether he chooses to," a flicker of something unreadable, but it passed too quickly for her to name it. "There's one more thing," Kalen said, gesturing for her to follow him back down the hall. I did some reading into your background before you arrived. I hope that's not too forward. Nesta tensed instinctively. What kind of reading? Nothing invasive, he assured her quickly. Just enough to know you studied botanical illustration before your family's circumstances changed, that you used to sell pressed flower art at a market stall in Catania on weekends. She hadn't expected anyone here to know that. She hadn't expected anyone here to care. He led her through a final set of doors, and Nesta stopped breathing for a second time that day. The room was a glass conservatory, vaulted and vast, filled with sunlight pouring through curved panes overhead. Rows of potted plants lined the walls, some familiar, some exotic species she'd only seen in textbooks. A long wooden table sat in the center, already stocked with sketchbooks, watercolor sets, and pressing paper, all still wrapped in plastic, waiting for her. I had it stocked this morning, Kalen said, almost sheepish now, hands back in his pockets. I wasn't sure exactly what you'd need, so I may have overordered. You have full access to this room, any time you like. Consider it yours. Nesta's throat tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had done something like this for her in years, not since before her parents died, before the debt, before every decision in her life became about survival instead of joy. She'd braced herself for a marriage built on fear and control. Instead, on her very first afternoon, a stranger had handed her back a piece of the life she thought she'd lost forever. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in months. Truly, this is… She shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. You don't need to thank me, Kalen said gently. You've been through enough. If a room full of paint and sunlight makes any of this easier, then it's the least this place can offer you. He left her alone shortly after, promising to check on her before dinner, and Nesta wandered the conservatory in a kind of stunned quiet, running her fingers over petals and leaves she hadn't touched in years. She didn't know yet that Kalen managed every detail of Villa Bellator, not because it was his job as an administrator, but because very little happened within these walls without his direct approval. She didn't know that the warmth she'd mistaken for a kind employee's courtesy was something far more deliberate. She only knew that for the first time since signing her name away in that cold Palermo boardroom, she felt something dangerously close to hope. And hope, in a place like this, was either the beginning of healing or the first careful thread of a much larger trap. By the 12th night, Nesta had learned the shape of her new life well enough to know its edges, the wing that was hers, the conservatory that had quickly become her sanctuary, the long, silent stretches of the villa where she almost never crossed paths with the man she'd married. Don Malachor kept to himself so thoroughly that some mornings she wondered if he was even in the house at all. She'd caught glimpses of him twice, once crossing a hallway with two men in dark suits trailing behind him, once standing on a distant terrace with a phone pressed to his ear, his back rigid and unreachable. Both times he hadn't looked at her. She told herself it didn't matter. She hadn't married him for warmth. What she hadn't expected was the insomnia. It crept up on her slowly, the way grief and fear tend to when you finally stop running long enough for them to catch you. During the day, she painted, she wandered the gardens, she let herself believe the villa was simply a beautiful place she was allowed to exist in. But at night, alone in the wide canopy bed, her mind refused to quiet. She thought about her brothers. She thought about the ledger of favors she now owed a family she barely understood. She thought about a stranger's cold grey eyes sliding past her like she wasn't in the room. So, on the 12th night, when sleep wouldn't come, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped down to the conservatory, hoping the smell of soil and green things might settle her. She wasn't expecting to find it already occupied. Kalen sat at the far end of the long wooden table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a small lamp casting warm light over a mess of papers and ledgers spread in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and instead of the polished, unhurried calm she'd come to associate with him, there was something rawer in his face. Tiredness, maybe, or the particular weariness of a man who worked long past when he should have stopped. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, setting down his pen. "Neither could you, apparently," Nesta said, gesturing at the papers. Trade ledgers, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. International shipping routes. It's tedious, but someone has to keep the numbers honest. He paused, studying her for a moment. Sit, I'll make tea. Chamomile, if you don't mind. It's what I drink when my brain won't stop working. She almost declined out of habit, out of the reflex of a girl who'd spent months making herself small and unremarkable so no one would notice her, need anything from her, or hurt her further. But something about the quiet conservatory at midnight, the soft lamplight, the ordinary comfort of tea being offered instead of demanded, made her sit. He returned a few minutes later with 2 steaming cups and settled across from her, not behind his ledgers this time, but angled toward her fully, like she was the only thing in the room worth his attention. "Tell me about the flowers," he said, nodding toward the sketchbook she'd left open on a side table days ago, now filled with careful renderings of hibiscus and bougainvillea. "You're talented, genuinely. I don't say that to be polite." Nesta felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to praise that didn't come wrapped in some kind of expectation. "It's just something I do to keep my hands busy." "That's not what I asked," Kaelin said gently, and there was no push in his voice, only patience. "I asked you to tell me about them." So she did, haltingly at first, and then with more ease than she'd expected, she told him about learning botanical illustration from a librarian in Catania who'd let her sit for hours copying old field guides. She told him about selling pressed flowers at the market stall on weekends, how she used to imagine each bouquet going home with someone who needed a small, beautiful thing in their life. She told him, quieter, that she'd stopped believing anyone needed beautiful things from her specifically, that after the debt, after everything, she'd started to think of herself as useful only in terms of what she could be traded for. Kaelin was quiet for a long moment after that, turning his teacup slowly in his hands. "You know that's not true," he said finally. "What you just said, about being useful only as something to be traded." "It's hard not to believe it," Nesta admitted, staring into her cup, "when the biggest thing anyone's ever wanted from me was my signature on a marriage contract." "For what it's worth," Kaelin said, "I don't think that contract is the most valuable thing about you. I think it's this." He nodded again toward her sketchbook. "The way you see things other people walk past without noticing. That's rare. I've read 100 trade agreements this month alone, and not one of them made me feel anything. Your flowers did, the first time I saw them." Nesta looked up at him, startled by the sincerity in his voice. There was no performance in it, no practiced charm, just quiet, careful honesty from a man who, she was beginning to realize, paid far more attention to her than anyone in this villa had any reason to. "You're very kind," she said softly. "I didn't expect kindness here." "Neither did you deserve to expect its absence," Kaelin replied. "Whatever this arrangement is, whatever it was built to solve, you're still a person, Nesta, not a line item. I'd like you to remember that, even on the nights it's hard to believe." They talked until the tea went cold and the sky outside the glass ceiling began its first faint shift toward grey. And when Nesta finally rose to return to her wing, something in her chest felt lighter than it had in months. A small, dangerous warmth she didn't yet have a name for, blooming quietly in a heart she'd been so careful to guard. She didn't know, walking back through the dark hallways, that the man she'd just spent hours confiding in kept those exact ledgers because no transaction in this empire moved without his signature. She only knew that for the first time since her parents died, someone had looked at her flowers and seen a person worth knowing. The gown arrived 3 days before the gala, along with a note in handwriting Nesta didn't recognize. "You will attend as Don Malacor's wife. Appearances are not optional." No warmth, no explanation, just an order. The first direct communication she'd received from her husband since the boardroom in Palermo. She stood in front of the mirror in her wing, watching the stylist pin the last strand of her hair into place, and felt the old, familiar knot tighten in her stomach, the one that had loosened so much over the past 2 weeks, thanks to sunlit mornings in the conservatory and quiet midnight conversations over chamomile tea. Tonight, that knot was back in full force. You look beautiful, the stylist said, stepping back. Nesta didn't feel beautiful. She felt like a prop being dressed for display. The car ride to Taormina was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the distant churn of the sea below the coastal road. When they arrived at the hotel, cameras were already waiting outside, a wall of flashing lights and shouted names, the press hungry for any glimpse of the notoriously private Don Malachor and the young bride no one had seen since the wedding announcement. He was waiting for her at the base of the steps. Up close, under the golden light of the hotel's entrance, he was even more imposing than she remembered from that first cold meeting. Tall, immaculate in black, his expression carved from the same unreadable stone as before. He offered his arm without a word, and she took it because refusing wasn't an option, not with a dozen lenses trained on them. "Smile," he murmured, the only thing he said to her before the doors opened. Not a request, an instruction. Inside, the gala unfolded exactly as she'd feared. Don Malachor moved through the crowd like a monument, greeted with reverence, feared with a politeness so thick it curdled, and Nesta trailed beside him like an accessory, introduced only as "my wife," never by name, never with warmth. He didn't touch her, except when appearances demanded it. He didn't speak to her, except to correct her posture once, quietly, when she let her shoulders slump under the weight of the evening. She watched him charm a senator's wife with 3 sentences and dismantle a rival businessman's confidence with 2, and she understood, with a sinking clarity, exactly what kind of man she had married. Not cruel, exactly, just utterly indifferent to her as anything other than a symbol standing beside him. By the time the dinner speeches ended and the crowd drifted toward the dance floor, Nesta had excused herself to the edge of the ballroom, her chest tight, her carefully arranged smile cracking at the corners. She slipped through a side door onto a private balcony overlooking the sea, desperate for air that didn't smell like perfume and old money. She didn't hear him approach until his voice broke the quiet. "You disappeared," Kaelan said. She turned, startled. She hadn't expected him here, hadn't even registered him inside the ballroom, though of course he would be. He managed the syndicate's affairs. A gala like this would need his quiet, careful oversight somewhere in the background. "I needed a minute," she admitted, wrapping her arms around herself despite the mild night air. "It's a lot, all of it." Kaelan crossed the balcony and leaned against the railing beside her, close enough that his presence felt like a wall between her and the noise still spilling faintly from inside. "He's not an easy man to stand beside," he said. "I imagine it's exhausting, being introduced as a possession for an entire evening." "You noticed that too," Nesta said, half a laugh, half something closer to tears. "I notice most things," Kaelan said quietly, "especially when they concern you." The words settled over her like warmth against the cold. She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself in the harsh fluorescent light of the ballroom, and found none of the practiced indifference she'd endured all night. Just steady, careful attention. The kind that made her feel, however briefly, like she wasn't invisible. "He didn't even use my name once tonight," she said, the hurt slipping out before she could stop it. "Not once, in 3 hours. "Then let me," Kaelan said gently. "Nesta." He said it like it mattered, like the shape of it in his mouth meant something. You don't need his attention to matter in this place. You never did. She felt something crack open in her chest, not painfully, but like a window finally letting in air after being sealed shut too long. Before she could think better of it, she asked, quiet and a little unsteady, "Will you dance with me? Just once, away from the cameras." Kaelan hesitated only a fraction of a second before offering his hand. "It would be my honor." There was no music out here, only the distant echo of the orchestra filtering through the glass doors and the steady rhythm of waves against the cliffs below. They swayed slowly in the moonlight, no photographers, no obligations, no cold instructions to smile for an audience that didn't care whether she was happy or simply present. For those few minutes, Nesta let herself forget the ballroom entirely, forget the husband who treated her like scenery, forget the debt that had brought her here, forget the fear that had followed her since Palermo. There was only the warmth of Kaelan's hand at her waist, the quiet steadiness of his breathing, and the strange, dangerous comfort of being seen by someone who seemed to actually want to look. "Thank you," she whispered, when the song, the imagined one, the one only they could hear, finally faded. "You don't have to thank me," Kaelan said, echoing words he'd said to her once before in a sunlit conservatory on her very first day. "Not for this, not ever." Neither of them noticed, in that fragile, golden moment, a pair of eyes watching from the shadowed doorway behind them, Don Malachor himself, unreadable as ever, saying nothing, doing nothing, simply observing his administrator and his bride with an expression no one in that ballroom would have known how to read. The trip into Catania had been Kaelan's idea. "You've been cooped up in that villa for a month," he'd said over breakfast, sliding a small stack of euros across the table like it was nothing at all. "Go buy more paper, more paints. Take a driver, take your time. You've earned a morning that belongs entirely to you." Nesta had almost cried at the offer, though she'd hidden it well by the time the car pulled away from Villa Bellator. A month ago, she would never have imagined being handed freedom so casually, as if trust were something simple instead of something she still wasn't sure she deserved. The art supply shop sat 2 streets back from the harbour, tucked between a bakery and a shuttered bookstore, its window display a chaos of pressed pigments and hand-bound sketchbooks that made her chest ache with something close to joy. She spent nearly an hour inside, running her fingers over paper stock, testing the weight of pencils, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like a person with a simple, uncomplicated life. She should have known it wouldn't last. She was standing outside the shop, a paper bag of supplies tucked under one arm, breathing in the salt-heavy harbour air, when a hand closed around her wrist and pulled her sharply into the narrow alley beside the building. Her scream caught in her throat the instant she recognized the face. Bram! Relief and fury collided in her chest so fast it left her dizzy. "What are you doing? You can't just grab me like that. You scared me half to death." "I had to," her brother said, glancing nervously toward the mouth of the alley, toward the driver waiting patiently by her car a block away. He looked thinner than she remembered, his eyes rimmed with the particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "I couldn't exactly walk up and knock on the front door of your husband's estate, could I?" "You shouldn't be here at all," Nesta hissed, though she pulled him into a fierce hug anyway, unable to stop herself. Whatever anger she felt couldn't compete with a month of missing him, missing Kian, missing the small, ordinary comfort of family. "How did you even know I'd be here?" "Kian's been watching the estate gates from a distance," Bram admitted. "We knew you'd have an outing eventually. We just needed a chance to talk without anyone from the syndicate listening." Something cold slid down Nesta's spine. Talk about what? Bram's jaw tightened, and in that instant she saw it. The same expression he used to wear right before confessing he'd wrecked the car, or missed a payment, or made some other reckless decision he already knew she'd hate. Her stomach dropped before he even opened his mouth. "We found an opportunity," he said. "A real one, Nesta. A shipping contract. Cargo routes through Malta, high-value goods, the kind of deal that could set us up for years. We just needed capital to get in." "Bram." Her voice came out sharper than she intended, edged with panic. "Please tell me you didn't." "We took a loan," he admitted, the words tumbling out fast now, like he needed to get them out before she could stop him. "An offshore lender. High interest, but short term. We'll pay it back the second the first shipment clears. Kian ran the numbers a dozen times. It's solid. I swear it's solid." "You swore to me you were done," Nesta said, her voice cracking. Her whole body had gone cold, despite the warm harbour sun. "I sold myself into a marriage with a man I'd never met to clear your debt, Bram. Do you understand that? I gave away my entire life so you and Kian could start over clean. And you're telling me you took out another loan? This one's different. It's never different." The words tore out of her louder than she meant them to, and she had to press a hand over her own mouth, glancing frantically toward the alley's mouth, terrified someone, anyone connected to the syndicate, might overhear. When she spoke again, it was barely above a whisper, shaking with barely contained fear. Please, please, Bram, walk away from it. Whatever the deal is, whatever money you'd make, it's not worth it. You don't understand what these people are capable of. You don't understand what I've seen. We're not dealing with the Morettis this time, Bram said, though the reassurance in his voice sounded thin even to Nesta's ears. It's a completely separate lender, a completely separate deal. There's no connection to your husband's family at all. That's exactly what you thought last time, Nesta said, and the memory of that terrible night, men standing silent outside their apartment door, the cold certainty that her brothers might not survive the month, rose up so vividly she had to steady herself against the alley wall. There's always a connection you don't see until it's too late. Bram's expression flickered. Guilt, maybe, or simply the stubborn refusal of a man who'd already made up his mind before he ever pulled her into this alley. The contracts are signed, Nesta. The money's already moving. He hesitated, and for a moment he looked young again, the way he had when they were small and their parents were still alive and none of this had happened yet. I just wanted you to hear it from me first, before you found out some other way. Undo it, she begged, gripping the front of his jacket with both hands, her paper bag of paints forgotten on the ground between them. Please, whatever it takes, whatever penalty for backing out, I'll find a way to help. I'll ask Kaylin, You can't ask anyone, Bram said sharply, gently prying her hands loose. That's the whole point, Nesta. Nobody at that estate can know. If word gets back to the Morettis that we're running deals behind their backs, even legitimate ones, it could look like a betrayal of the arrangement. You understand that better than anyone. He was right, and the certainty of it settled over her like a stone. Please be careful, she whispered instead, because it was the only thing left to say. Please, that's all I'm asking. Bram pressed a quick, apologetic kiss to the top of her head, the same gesture he'd used since they were small, and slipped back out of the alley before the driver could notice anything amiss. Nesta stood alone amid the smell of salt and old stone for a long moment, her paper bag of paints and pencils suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. The bright, uncomplicated morning she'd been given now curdled into something sharp and frightened. She didn't tell anyone what happened in that alley. Not the driver waiting patiently by the car, not Kaylin when she returned to the villa with a smile stretched carefully over her fear. She had no way of knowing yet that her silence would not be enough to keep the danger from finding her anyway. For 2 weeks, Nesta carried the weight of Catania alone. She told herself it was for the best, that keeping Bram's secret was the only way to protect him, that dragging Kaylin into it would only make things worse. But the silence gnawed at her in ways she hadn't expected. She found herself watching the villa's phones ring with new suspicion, flinching at unfamiliar cars pulling through the front gates, lying awake at night, running through every possible way the situation could unravel. By the 45th day, the anxiety had curdled into something she couldn't sit with any longer. She needed advice, real, legal advice, the kind that might help her understand exactly how exposed her brothers actually were, and whether there was any quiet way to intervene without alerting the very people she was trying to avoid. Kaylin was the only person in this world she trusted enough to ask. She found her way to the private study on the villa's second floor, a room she'd passed 100 times but never entered, the place where Kaylin handled the business she still understood only in vague, uneasy outlines. The door was open a few inches, light spilling out into the hallway, and when she knocked softly and got no answer, she assumed he'd simply stepped away and left it unlocked by accident. She pushed the door open, intending only to leave a note on his desk asking him to find her when he returned. The study was exactly as she might have pictured it. Tall bookshelves, a heavy oak desk, the faint smell of old paper and coffee gone cold. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, catching dust motes above a mess of documents spread across the desk's surface, clearly abandoned mid-review. She hadn't meant to look. She told herself that later, over and over, as if repetition could make it true. But her eyes caught on a shipping manifest near the top of the pile, a company name printed in bold at the header. Calder Maritime Logistics, her brother's company. Her heart lurched, curiosity overriding every instinct that told her to walk away. She stepped closer, scanning the page, and found herself staring at a document she didn't fully understand, but recognized enough to feel cold dread pooling in her stomach. An internal file labeled, in stark black lettering, Moretti Syndicate, Asset Protection Division, Confidential. Beneath the heading was a list of names and companies under what the document called Monitored Protective Status. Her brother's shipping company sat third from the top, flagged with a notation in tight, careful handwriting. Subject requires oversight. Related party, N. Calder. Do not disclose surveillance. The handwriting was unmistakable. She'd watched it fill margins in trade ledgers over countless cups of chamomile tea. She'd seen it scrawled across notes left for her in the conservatory. Had the orchids moved to better light, thought you'd approve, K. Kaylin's handwriting. Nesta's hands had gone numb around the edges of the page. She read the notation again, and then a third time, as though repetition might rearrange the words into something less frightening. Do not disclose surveillance. Her brothers weren't just tangled up in a risky loan they'd hidden from her. They were being watched, monitored, tracked, filed away in a confidential syndicate document, and the man responsible for that surveillance was the same man who'd held her hand at a gala, who'd told her she mattered, who'd made her believe, foolishly, that Villa Bellator was somewhere she'd finally found safety. He knew. The thought landed like a blow. He's known this whole time. Her mind raced backward through every gentle conversation, every soft-spoken kindness, searching for the moment the mask might have slipped, some sign she'd been too naive or too desperate for warmth to notice. Had any of it been real? Or had she simply been another line item in a ledger he managed with the same careful, unreadable precision he brought to everything else? Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, unhurried, familiar. Nesta barely had time to set the page back down before Kaylin appeared in the doorway, a folder tucked under one arm, his expression shifting the instant he saw her standing at his desk. Nesta? His voice was careful, measuring. I didn't expect you here. The door was open, she said, and hated how thin her own voice sounded. I came to ask for legal advice. About corporate loans. About… She stopped herself, unsure how much to reveal, terrified suddenly of what admitting anything might cost her brothers. It doesn't matter. His eyes moved past her to the desk, to the exact document she'd been reading, and something flickered across his face too fast for her to name. Not quite alarm, not quite guilt, but close enough to both that her stomach twisted painfully. What did you see? He asked, quietly. Enough, Nesta said, backing a step away from the desk, as though putting distance between herself and the papers might undo what she'd already learned. Enough to know you've been watching my brothers this whole time, that you knew about the loan they took, that you've had them under some kind of surveillance, and never said a word to me. Nesta, it's not what it looks like. Then tell me what it looks like, she said, and to her own surprise, her voice didn't shake this time. Something colder had settled beneath the fear, something that demanded answers instead of comfort. Because from where I'm standing, the man who told me I mattered has been quietly keeping tabs on the two people I love most and hiding it behind kindness. Kaylin set the folder down slowly, as though buying himself time, his usual easy composure cracking at the edges for the first time since she'd known him. There are things about my position here that I haven't explained to you, he said carefully. Things that are complicated, and that I intended to tell you when the time was right. When was the time going to be right, Kaylin? Nesta demanded, the betrayal sharpening into something close to grief. Before or after my brothers disappeared into whatever this file actually means? He didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, heavy, unresolved, thick with everything neither of them was ready to say, Nesta felt the fragile trust she'd built over the past month and a half begin to splinter down the middle. She turned and left the study without waiting for his response, her thoughts racing far ahead of her feet, already certain of one thing. Whatever kindness Kaylin had shown her, it had never told her the whole truth. She had no idea yet exactly how much more truth there was left to uncover. 13 days passed after the study, and Nesta and Kaelan settled into a careful, uneasy truce. He hadn't tried to explain further, not fully, only that his role at the estate involved protective measures for people connected to the family by marriage, and that her brother's file existed to keep them safe from threats they didn't know existed, not to control them. It wasn't a lie, exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and Nesta knew it the way you know a held breath by the tightness in your own chest. Still, she hadn't confronted him again. Whatever answers she needed, she suspected they lived somewhere beyond what a study full of confidential files could tell her. When Kaelan invited her to Venice, a private art acquisition, he'd explained, a rare collection of botanical illustrations from the 18th century that the family was considering for purchase, she almost said no. But curiosity, and something more stubborn underneath it, won out. If there were answers to find, perhaps distance from the villa's watchful walls would make them easier to see. The gallery sat tucked along a narrow canal in the Dorsoduro district, unremarkable from the outside, its heavy wooden door giving no hint of the opulence within. Nesta wandered the main hall slowly, entranced despite herself by watercolor renderings of orchids and ferns 2 centuries old, their pigments still impossibly vivid under soft gallery lighting. Kaelan moved beside her, quieter than usual, occasionally murmuring translations of the Italian placards, but his attention seemed split, distracted, glancing more than once toward a set of heavy curtains at the rear of the hall. "I need to speak with the gallery director," he said eventually, checking his watch. 10 minutes, no more. Will you be all right here?" "I'll survive an art gallery," Nesta said, with the faintest hint of the dry humor that had, weeks ago, come so much easier between them. He disappeared through a side door, and Nesta continued her slow circuit of the room, until she realized, with a small jolt of frustration, that her sketchpad, the one she carried everywhere now, out of habit as much as necessity, was missing. She retraced her steps, checking benches and windowsills, before recalling she'd set it down near the back of the hall, close to those same heavy curtains Kaelan had kept glancing toward. She pushed through a gap in the fabric without thinking twice, expecting a quiet storage room, maybe a private viewing salon. What she found instead stopped her breath entirely. Beyond the curtain was a wide, dimly lit salon, its walls lined not with paintings, but with men, a dozen or more, dressed in dark, expensive suits, standing in careful formation around a long table. She recognized none of their faces individually, but she recognized the posture of every man in that room instantly. The stillness, the deference, the particular quality of silence reserved for people who feared the person they were listening to. At the head of the table stood Tariq, Don Malachor, her husband in name and public record, the towering, cold-eyed figure from the boardroom and the gala, the man who'd never once spoken her name. He was on one knee. Nesta's mind struggled to process the image, the wrongness of it settling over her like ice water. The most feared man in the syndicate, the figure whose name alone made grown businessmen stammer, kneeling in formal, unmistakable respect. Not before some elder statesman of the underworld, not before some council of anonymous power. Before Kaelan. She hadn't even seen him enter the salon, but there he stood at the table's opposite end, sleeves rolled, posture utterly transformed from the gentle, unhurried administrator she'd shared chamomile tea with 100 nights ago. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of its usual softness, low, clipped, absolute, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The Marseille route stays closed until the audit clears," Kaelan was saying, addressing the room with a calm that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting ever could. "Anyone who moves cargo through it before then answers to me personally. Is that understood?" A murmur of assent rippled through the room. Tariq, the supposed Don, the man whose signature carried more fear than any other name in southern Italy, rose from his knee only when Kaelan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of permission. Nesta's hand flew to her mouth to stifle the gasp climbing up her throat, and she stumbled back a step, catching the edge of the curtain, her heart slamming so hard against her ribs she was certain the sound alone would give her away. Malachor is a title. The realization crashed through her all at once, rearranging every piece of the past 2 months into a shape she hadn't let herself imagine. Tariq isn't the real Don. He's a decoy, a mask, and Kaylin— She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. The truth was standing 8 feet away from her, giving orders that reshaped shipping empires with the same quiet authority he'd once used to promise her brother's debt was cleared. He wasn't lying about clearing the debt, she realized, the pieces slotting together with dizzying speed. He was never just an administrator handling someone else's paperwork. He was the one deciding whose debts got erased. He decided mine. She backed further away from the curtain, terrified suddenly of being seen, of the consequences that might follow discovering something this dangerous, this deliberately hidden. Her pulse roared in her ears as she retreated across the main gallery hall, snatching her sketchpad from the bench where she'd left it, forcing her expression into something resembling calm just as the side door opened and Kaylin emerged, adjusting his cuffs, his gentle, familiar smile already sliding back into place like nothing at all had happened. "Sorry for the delay," he said easily. The director had some concerns about provenance. All settled now. Nesta looked at him, really looked, searching his face for some sign of the man she'd just watched command a room full of syndicate leaders with nothing more than his voice, and found only the soft, warm eyes she'd grown to trust over the past 2 months. "Shall we head back to the hotel?" he asked. "I imagine you're tired." You have no idea, she thought, her sketchpad clutched tight against her chest, the entire architecture of her understanding of him collapsing and rebuilding itself in the space of a single, silent breath. "Yes," she said instead, forcing her voice steady. "I think I am." She didn't tell him what she'd seen, not yet. But she knew, walking beside him through the narrow, lantern-lit streets of Venice, that the quiet dawn confrontation she'd been dreading and needing could no longer be avoided. She didn't sleep. Nesta lay awake in the hotel suite long after Kaylin had said goodnight, listening to the distant slap of water against stone, replaying the image of Tariq kneeling, of Kaylin's voice stripped of all its gentleness, sharp and absolute. By the time grey light began creeping over the rooftops outside her window, she'd made her decision. She couldn't carry this silently the way she'd carried Bram's secret. Not this. Not when the truth reached this far into the center of her own life. She found Kaylin in the small courtyard behind the hotel, standing alone near the canal's edge, watching the mist lift off the water as the city stirred awake around them. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and something in his expression told her he'd been expecting this. Perhaps he'd known the moment she stumbled back from that curtain in the gallery. Perhaps he'd always known this morning would come. "You saw," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I saw everything," Nesta confirmed, wrapping her arms around herself despite the mild morning air, the chill coming from somewhere far deeper than temperature. "Tariq, on his knee, in front of you." Her voice cracked slightly. "I saw you give orders that made grown men in that room go silent. I saw the truth, Kaylin, or whatever your actual name is." "Kaylin is my name," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice carried no softness meant to soothe her, only a tired, careful honesty. That part was never a lie. "Then what was?" she demanded. "Everything else? The tea, the conservatory, the way you talked to me like I mattered? Was any of it real, or was I just another asset you were managing?" "It was all real," Kaylin said, taking a step toward her before seeming to think better of it, stopping himself a few feet away instead, as though giving her the space to run if she needed it. "That's the part I need you to understand, even if nothing else makes sense right now." "Then explain the rest," Nesta said, her voice shaking now despite her effort to keep it steady. "Explain why the man I watched kneel before you in that gallery is the same man who's supposed to be my husband. Explain why everyone in Palermo whispers Don Malacor's name like they're afraid the walls themselves might report them to him, while the actual man behind that name has been serving me tea and asking about my flowers." Kaylin exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again, it was with the quiet, deliberate care of someone choosing words he'd rehearsed many times, perhaps for exactly this moment, and never expected to need so soon. "Malachor isn't a person," he said. "Not really. It's a title, a mask this family has used for 3 generations, long before I was born into it. The man who wears the face of Malachor in public, Tariq, is exactly that, a figurehead, someone visible enough, frightening enough, to draw the attention of rivals and enemies away from where the real decisions are actually made." "And where are they made?" Nesta asked, though some cold, sinking part of her already knew the answer. "At a desk," Kaelin said simply. "Behind paperwork nobody bothers to scrutinize too closely, because who would suspect the quiet administrator of holding more power than the Don himself? I am the real Malachor, Nesta. I have been since I was 23 years old. Tariq protects that secret with his life every single day, because if it were known, if rivals understood, the empire could be dismantled by removing one soft-spoken man instead of one imposing figurehead, I wouldn't survive the year." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, rippling outward through everything Nesta thought she understood. She thought of the contract she'd signed in Palermo, of the towering, indifferent stranger who'd barely looked at her, and of the gentle administrator who'd shown her to a sunlit conservatory an hour later. She thought of every kindness Kaelin had shown her, every late-night conversation, every moment she'd let herself believe she was safe. All of it had happened under the quiet, deliberate authority of the very man whose name had once made her tremble in fear. "You let me believe I married a stranger," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "You let me be afraid of a man who was never really in charge of anything, while you—" She shook her head, unable to finish. "You knew exactly who I was the entire time. You cleared my brother's debt because you chose to. You had that power from the very beginning." "I did," Kaelin admitted, no flinching in his voice, no attempt to soften the admission. "And I'd make that same choice again, without hesitation. Everything I've told you about wanting to protect you, about believing you deserved more than fear in this house, that was never a performance, Nesta. I've watched you find yourself again these past 2 months, the way you laugh now, the way you talk about your art without apologizing for taking up space with it. I didn't fabricate any of that. I simply didn't correct your assumption about who held the real power here, because the truth would have put you in more danger than the lie ever did." "You should have trusted me with it," Nesta said, tears finally slipping free despite her best effort to hold them back. "Even if it was dangerous, even if it complicated everything, you should have let me choose whether I wanted that truth, instead of deciding for me." Kaelin's jaw tightened, something raw and pained flickering across his usually composed features. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have. I told myself I was protecting you. Maybe I was only protecting myself, from the moment you'd look at me the way you're looking at me right now." Nesta didn't answer. She couldn't. The betrayal sat too heavy in her chest, tangled hopelessly with everything she still felt for him despite it, the warmth, the gratitude, the dangerous, undeniable tenderness that had grown between them across 2 months of stolen honesty in a house built entirely on secrets. "I need time," she finally said, backing away toward the hotel's rear entrance, unable to meet his eyes any longer. "I need to think. Alone." Kaelin didn't follow her. He simply stood at the canal's edge as the morning mist finally lifted, watching her retreat into the hotel, his expression unreadable once more. Not the mask of the gentle administrator, not the cold authority of Don Malachor, but something rawer and more uncertain than either. A man watching the one person who'd ever seen him honestly walk away, uncertain if she'd ever choose to look at him the same way again. 11 days passed after Venice, and Nesta and Kaelin barely spoke. She'd retreated back into herself the moment they returned to Villa Bellator, polite at meals, distant in the hallways, spending long hours alone in the conservatory with brushes she rarely lifted. The betrayal hadn't faded, but neither had the ache of missing him, the strange grief of losing someone who was still standing right in front of her every day. She hadn't decided what to do with either feeling. She hadn't needed to, not yet, because on the 70th day, the phone call came, and every private struggle she'd been carrying collapsed under the weight of something far more urgent. It was Kian's voice on the line, thin and panicked, barely recognizable. "Nesta, they've got Bram. They've got both of us. They're saying you need to come, or—" The line crackled, cut off by another voice, unfamiliar and hard, before Kian could finish the sentence. "Your brothers made a very poor business decision," the new voice said, calm in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. "The Malta shipping contract they signed 3 months ago belonged to us. We built that route. We spent 2 years securing it, and your brothers walked into a deal engineered specifically to draw them in. A deal that would let us seize Moretti shipping lines through the back door, using a family connected to the Don's own household as leverage." A pause, deliberate and cruel. "Come to the Messina warehouse on Via del Porto, alone. Bring nothing but yourself, and we'll discuss terms for your brother's release." The line went dead before she could respond. Nesta stood frozen in the villa's front hallway for only a few seconds before instinct took over. She didn't call for Kalen. She didn't call for security, or Tariq, or anyone connected to the estate at all. Some desperate, panicked part of her, convinced that involving the syndicate machinery would only escalate things further. That her brother's one chance lay in her showing up exactly as instructed, alone, unarmed, willing to negotiate herself out of a debt that had never truly stopped following her family. She took a car from the staff garage before anyone could question her and drove the 90 minutes to Messina with her hands locked, white-knuckled on the wheel, rehearsing words she knew wouldn't be enough. The warehouse sat at the edge of the industrial harbour, an unremarkable building among dozens just like it, corrugated steel walls rusted at the seams. A man was waiting at the side entrance when she arrived, silent, gesturing her inside without a word. Bram and Kian were seated in a bare, fluorescent-lit office at the building's centre, wrists bound to the arms of 2 metal chairs, faces bruised in a way that made Nesta's stomach lurch violently. Kian's lip was split. Bram's eye was swollen nearly shut. "Nesta," Bram started, straining against the ropes, before a hand cracked hard across his face silenced him. "You shouldn't have come," Kian said instead, voice hoarse. "This isn't a negotiation, Nesta. It's a trap." "Quiet," said the man from before, stepping into the light. He was older than she expected, silver-haired, dressed with the same expensive, understated elegance she'd seen on syndicate men throughout her marriage. "Miss Calder, or should I say Mrs. Mellacour?" "Let them go," Nesta said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the way her legs trembled beneath her. "They're not part of this. Whatever conflict you have with the Moretti family, it has nothing to do with my brothers." "On the contrary," the man said, circling slowly, "your brothers are the entire point. Do you understand what it means to have leverage against a man like Mellacour? He's untouchable. No one gets close enough to threaten him directly." His eyes glinted. "But everyone has a weakness. His just happens to be the frightened little bride he married to clean up her family's debt. You, and by extension, them." Nesta's blood ran cold. He knows. He knows exactly who holds the real power, and he's using me, used my brothers, to reach Kalen. "What do you want?" she asked, though she already feared she knew the answer. "Full withdrawal of Moretti forces from 3 shipping corridors within the week," the man said simply. "Signed, notarized, delivered to me personally. In exchange, your brothers walk out of here breathing. And you, of course, along with them, once the paperwork is confirmed." "I don't have that authority," Nesta said, desperation cracking through her composure. "I can't sign syndicate shipping contracts. I'm not—" "But you can call him," the man interrupted, sliding a phone across the desk toward her. "And I imagine the real Mellacour will find it very persuasive, hearing his wife's voice from inside this building." Nesta stared at the phone, her mind racing through every possible outcome, none of them good. If she called Kalen and he refused the demands, her brothers might not survive the hour. If she called and he complied, an entire empire's shipping security would be compromised, and she had no doubt the consequences of that would ripple far beyond this warehouse, far beyond her family. Before she could reach for the phone, the man's expression shifted, something tightening behind his eyes as a low murmur passed through the men stationed near the warehouse's front entrance, radios crackling with hurried, tense chatter. "What's happening?" The silver-haired man snapped toward his subordinates, his composure fraying for the first time. "Sir," one of the men started, voice unsteady, "there's a convoy outside. 12 vehicles minimum. They're not announcing themselves." Nesta's heart lurched with something dangerously close to hope, though fear still gripped her chest just as tightly. She hadn't called Kalen. She hadn't needed to. Somehow, impossibly, he already knew. The silver-haired man's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip, his gaze snapping back toward Nesta with sudden, ugly calculation. "Get her against the wall," he barked at his men. "If this is Malakor's people, we need every piece of leverage we've got. Bring the brothers, too. Nobody sets foot inside without terms on the table." Rough hands seized Nesta's arms, dragging her toward the wall beside her brother's chairs as the warehouse door rattled under the weight of something far larger arriving outside, engines idling, boots against gravel, a silence descending over the industrial harbor so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Whatever was coming through that door next, Nesta understood, with a strange, terrified clarity, that it would answer every question she still carried about the man she'd married, and about the man she'd actually fallen for. The warehouse door didn't burst open. It simply opened, slow, deliberate, almost polite, and that quiet control frightened Nesta more than any violent entrance could have. Kalen walked in alone. No security flanking him, no weapons drawn, nothing of the armed convoy she'd heard idling outside. He wore the same simple grey suit he might have worn to review shipping manifests at the villa, hands loose at his sides, expression calm in a way that made every man in that fluorescent-lit office go rigid with uncertainty. Behind him, framed in the doorway, stood 12 figures in dark tactical gear, utterly still, awaiting a signal that hadn't come yet. "Marchetti," Kalen said, and Nesta realized with a jolt that he knew the silver-haired man's name. "I have to admit, I didn't expect you to be quite this reckless. Kidnapping is beneath even your reputation." "Malakor," Marchetti said, his composure cracking visibly at the sight of him, the pistol at his hip suddenly looking less like leverage and more like a trembling admission of fear. "I wasn't expecting you personally. You assumed I'd send Tarek to handle this," Kalen finished for him, stepping further into the room, his gaze sweeping once, briefly, to where Nesta stood pinned against the wall beside her bound and battered brothers. Something flickered across his face at that, sharp, controlled, and utterly unlike anything Nesta had seen from him before, gone again almost as quickly as it appeared. "You assumed wrong. When someone touches my family, I come myself." "My family?" The words landed in Nesta's chest with an intensity that startled her, even amid the terror of the moment. "Let's discuss terms," Marchetti said, forcing steel back into his voice, gesturing toward the pistol on his hip without quite drawing it. "You withdraw from the Malta corridor, the Sicilian coastal routes, and the Naples freight lines. In exchange, the girl and her brothers walk free, and this entire unfortunate incident disappears." Kalen studied him for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, the gentle administrator's voice was gone entirely, replaced by something low, unhurried, and absolute. The same voice Nesta had heard from behind the curtain in Venice, commanding an entire room of syndicate leaders into silence. "You're not in a position to negotiate terms, Marchetti," he said. "You're in a position to survive the next 10 minutes, if you're careful about what you do next." "I have 3 hostages," Marchetti snapped, some of his earlier confidence returning. "You have 12 men at the door. Don't mistake my patience for weakness, Malakor." "I'm not mistaking anything," Kalen said. "I've spent the drive here reviewing your accounts. All of them." He let the words settle, watching the flicker of unease cross Marchetti's face. "Your offshore holding company in Malta, the one financing this entire operation, folded 20 minutes ago. Frozen assets, seized shipments, 3 banking partners who suddenly discovered they no longer wanted your business. Your loan to the Calder brothers, the one you dressed up as a legitimate cargo investment specifically to lure them into this trap? Already recalled, already defaulted, already reported to every regulator with jurisdiction over your shell companies. Marchetti's face drained of color. That's not possible. Those accounts have been secure for years. They were secure against people who didn't know exactly where to look, Kalen said. I've known about your operation since the moment your people first approached Bram Calder with that Malta contract. I let it play out because I wanted to see exactly how far you were willing to go and exactly who else in your network would expose themselves helping you. His voice never rose, never wavered, and somehow that steadiness felt far more dangerous than shouting ever could have. Congratulations. You've just handed me a complete map of every enemy holding still hoping to challenge Moretti shipping lines. And you've bankrupted yourself doing it. The warehouse fell utterly silent. Nesta watched Marchetti's men exchange uncertain glances, the desperate calculation of soldiers realizing their leader's power had evaporated in the space of a single conversation. You're bluffing, Marchetti said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him completely. Check your phone, Kalen said simply. With visibly shaking hands, Marchetti pulled his phone from his jacket, and Nesta watched the last of his composure collapse as he stared at whatever notification had just arrived. Some cascade of failed transfers, frozen holdings, a financial collapse unfolding in real time. You have two choices, Kalen continued, stepping closer now, his presence filling the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with absolute, unshakable authority. Release my wife and her brothers immediately, walk out of this warehouse and disappear from Sicily entirely. You'll have nothing left here to protect anyway. Or force my hand and discover exactly how much further than bankruptcy I'm willing to go for the people you just put your hands on. The threat hung in the air, cold and precise, carrying none of the theatrical menace Nesta had expected from a man in Kalen's position, only quiet, terrible certainty. Marchetti's hand fell away from his pistol. Release them, he barked at his men, voice hollow with defeat. Untie the brothers, now. Rough hands fumbled with the ropes binding Bram and Kian, and the moment they were free, Nesta rushed to them, pulling both brothers into a fierce, trembling embrace, tears finally breaking free after hours of forced composure. Kian winced against his injuries, but held on tight regardless, and Bram, swollen eye and all, managed a shaky, apologetic smile over her shoulder. Kalen didn't move from his position near the door, watching the reunion with an expression Nesta couldn't quite read, until Marchetti's men had fully cleared the room and his own security detail stepped forward to secure the perimeter. Only then did he cross the room toward her, his composure softening slightly, the coldness of Don Malachor giving way, piece by piece, to something gentler, something closer to the man she'd shared chamomile tea with in a sunlit conservatory. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching her face with a careful, desperate thoroughness that told her exactly how afraid he'd been, despite the icy control he'd maintained through the entire confrontation. "I'm all right," Nesta managed, her voice still unsteady. "Because of you." "I should have found you faster," Kalen said, something raw breaking through his usual composure. "I should have known the moment you left the villa. I'm sorry it took this long." Nesta looked at him, really looked, taking in the man who'd just dismantled an enemy's entire financial empire without raising his voice, who'd walked into a room full of armed men with nothing but calm, absolute authority, all to protect a family that wasn't even fully his own by blood. "You came," she said simply. "That's what matters." Behind them, Bram and Kian exchanged a wide-eyed glance, finally understanding, in the space of a single terrifying afternoon, exactly who their sister had really married. 15 days after Messina, the villa felt different in a way Nesta struggled to name. Not smaller, exactly, but softer, as though the walls themselves had finally stopped holding their breath. Her brothers were safe, more than safe. Under Kalen's direct instruction, their reckless debt had been dismantled entirely and restructured into something almost unrecognizable. A formal community service arrangement, overseen by legitimate maritime authorities, Kaylin had quietly connected them with, designed to teach them the discipline neither of them had ever been forced to learn. No threats. No interest rates designed to swallow them whole. Just honest work, honest oversight, and, for the first time in either of their lives, an actual path forward that didn't depend on someone else's mercy. Bram had called twice that week already, his voice lighter than she'd heard it in years, full of tentative plans for a future that finally felt like it belonged to him. Kian had sent a photograph of his first supervised shift at the Messina Port Authority, grinning despite the fading bruise still yellowing beneath his eye. Watching her brothers rebuild themselves from a distance, safe and unafraid, was a relief so profound that Nesta sometimes found herself crying over nothing at all, over morning coffee, over sunlight on the water, over the sheer, uncomplicated fact that they were simply alive and free. But healing her own heart had proven far more complicated than healing her family's finances. She and Kaylin had spoken little in the days following Messina, not from anger this time, but from the strange, careful hesitation of two people who'd seen every version of each other now. The gentle administrator, the absolute authority behind the Malachor name, the man who'd hidden the truth to protect her, and the man who'd walked into a warehouse full of armed enemies without hesitation the moment she was in danger. Nesta had needed time to let those versions settle into a single, whole understanding of who he actually was. She found him on the evening of the 85th day exactly where she'd first fallen for him, the sunlit conservatory, though the golden hour light now slanted low and soft through the glass panes, painting everything in amber. He was seated at the long wooden table, not buried in ledgers this time, but simply waiting, as though he'd known, somehow, that this was the evening she'd finally come to him. "You found your peace with them," Kaylin said, rising as she entered, nodding toward the phone in her hand, still warm from her last call with Bram. "I did," Nesta said, setting it aside on the table. "Thanks to you." "Thanks to you," he corrected gently. "You're the one who signed that contract in Palermo. You're the one who walked into a warehouse for them without hesitation. Everything I did afterward was only ever in service of protecting what you already built." Nesta studied him for a long moment, this man who'd once been introduced to her as nothing more than an administrator handling paperwork, who had, in truth, been quietly reshaping the entire architecture of her life from the very first evening they met. She thought of the boy he must have been at 23, inheriting an empire's real power under the cover of someone else's face, choosing to live his entire adult life as a shadow so the people he loved could stay safe. "I understand now," she said quietly, "why you built it the way you did. The mask, Tariq, all of it. I was angry that you didn't trust me with the truth sooner. I still think you should have, but I understand why." "I was afraid," Kaylin admitted, the confession costing him something visible in the way his shoulders dropped slightly. "Not of you learning who I really was. Afraid of what it might cost you to know it. Every person who's ever gotten close to the truth of Malachor has become a target the moment the knowledge left this house. I couldn't bear the thought of that shadow falling over you." "It found me anyway," Nesta said softly, "in a warehouse in Messina, and you came for me regardless of what it cost to expose yourself." "I would do it again," Kaylin said, without a flicker of hesitation. 1,000 times over if it meant keeping you safe." The conservatory around them had grown quiet, the golden light deepening toward evening, and Nesta felt the last of her guarded distance finally begin to dissolve. Not because the danger was gone, not because every question had been answered, but because she understood, standing in this glass room full of the flowers he'd given her the very first day, that everything gentle he'd shown her had always been real, even hidden beneath a mask built to keep the people he loved alive. "Your brothers are safe now," Kaylin said, his voice carrying a new kind of gentleness, not the careful softness of a man managing a fragile arrangement, but the honest vulnerability of someone finally allowed to speak plainly. "The debt that brought you here no longer exists. If you wanted to leave, Truly, leave. No contracts, no obligations, a life entirely your own, somewhere far from all of this. I would arrange it myself, and I would understand completely. Nesta felt her breath catch, the weight of the offer settling over her. An escape route handed to her freely, no strings, no conditions, from the one man who could have bound her here forever with nothing but silence. She thought of the frightened girl who'd signed her name in a cold Palermo boardroom, terrified of the towering stranger she believed she'd married. She thought of the sunlit conservatory that had become her sanctuary, the midnight tea that had cracked open her guarded heart, the balcony in Taormina where someone had finally said her name like it mattered. She thought of Venice, of the warehouse in Messina, of every layer stripped away until only the truth remained. A man who had built an empire's worth of power and used every ounce of it, again and again, simply to protect her. "I don't want to leave," Nesta said, closing the distance between them until she stood close enough to see the quiet hope flickering behind his careful composure. "I spent my whole life being useful only in what I could be traded for. You're the first person who ever made me feel like I was worth protecting instead. I'm not walking away from that. Not now that I finally understand what it means." Kaelin reached for her hand, slow and certain, and Nesta let him take it. "Then stay," he said softly. "Not as Don Malakor's wife, as mine, as Kaelin's." "I choose you," Nesta whispered. "Not the title, not the empire, just you." Outside the conservatory's glass walls, the Sicilian sun sank lower over the sea, painting the water in shades of gold and violet, and Nesta stood in the arms of the man behind the secret, no longer a frightened girl bound by contract and debt, but a woman who had chosen, with her whole heart, to stand openly beside the true king, hidden all along behind an administrator's quiet desk.